Jackie Larkin, and I'd like to welcome everyone. If you're having any technical issues, just right off the top, send a chat message to Aurora. That's under the label Sierra Club BC, and I think she'll be able to help you. Putting that aside, you know this is being recorded, and I want to welcome everybody. We were thrilled to get such a big registration on this. We know that not everybody is going to be here tonight, that you'll probably watch it later, but that's fine. So I live and work on the traditional territory of the Hesquiaht peoples in the community known as Metchosin, which is on the southwest coast of Vancouver Island. I'm very grateful for the millennia of care by Indigenous people for these lands and these waters. And as a settler, I take responsibility to support Indigenous rights and title, and to contribute as best I can to the long process of dismantling colonialism. And I want to speak to my gratitude to the ancient forests that are the source of so much that is life-giving. And I invite all of you who are on this call to come together and to join me in taking just one or two deep breaths, just a strong deep breath, and allow your love for these forests to pass through your hearts and your minds. And to know that there's a couple of hundred other folks breathing with you, connecting with all of the humans on this webinar. And who knows, maybe the more than human world is paying attention to. And I want to express gratitude to you, to all of you who've turned up tonight, for all of your work throughout this territory of what is called British Columbia. For those of you who promoted the declaration, which brought this grouping together and which was the basis for the very successful Old Growth Rally that we had in February, at the end of February. But also to gratitude to you for all of the actions that you take in your nations and your local communities in defense of forest ecosystems. And maybe, I don't know if you're new to this webinar and to maybe even new to this topic area, I thank you for your curiosity and your desire to connect with one another. So I am from a group called Elders for Ancient Trees. It's a settler elders group that was formed during the Fairy Creek experience. And we continue to organize and to advocate for ancient forests throughout all of British Columbia, and to build relationships of solidarity with First Nations land defenders and with forest protectors everywhere. So last year we had a webinar, which I also moderated, called Fact and Fiction. And this year we're calling it What's Up with Old Growth, but it could just as easily have been Fact and Fiction iteration 2. We're hoping tonight in our short time together to get a handle on what is happening within the forests and with the government, especially as this time as the deferrals that have been made are actually drawing to close, and we're trying to find out what's happening. We want to ground ourselves in the clear recognition that these forests are on First Nations land. We want to feel that you can go away from this with a greater ability to have effective conversations with MLAs or people in your community or with other government decision makers. And I hope that you'll feel inspired to continue to put maximum pressure on this government in defense of what we all value so deeply. So we will not be having a broad discussion of strategy in the limited time that we have, but we recognize that aspects of strategy will doubtless percolate in your questions and the comments that people will put into our way of communicating, which I'll go into in a minute. But before I give any more details about our format, I'd like to welcome our first speaker. It's my pleasure and my honor to introduce Mariah Charleson, who is a member of the Hesquiaht First Nation. It's the most northerly and the most remote of the Hesquiaht Nations in Clayoquot Sound. And she's, well, she'll tell you what she's going to speak about, but I just want to note that it's a critical aspect of our context in all of this work we do, that old growth ecosystems grow and flourish on the territories of First Nations all throughout this province. So welcome to you, Mariah. Thank you for joining us.
Tleko. Before I formally introduce myself, I would like to first acknowledge that I am on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. I'm actually here with a whole bunch of chiefs and leaders from all over Vancouver Island until Thursday for a regional health caucus. But I'm really happy and honored to be here this evening. Oklas Luchin Suta, Hesquiaht Nation, Kinquashtakump Aksops, Ohoksa Ichum Munaquin Ochis Chisma. So what I said there is my Ku'as name is Luchin Suta. My English name is Mariah Charleson. I am a woman from the Hesquiaht First Nation. I belong to the House of Kinquashtakump, and my parents are Munaquin and Chisma, Stephen and Karen Charleson. It's a real honor to be here this evening to talk about such an important topic, old growth and the importance of healthy, thriving, and living forests. I've been asked to speak this evening through the lens of Indigenous rights and also sharing the cultural importance of old growth. And to understand the cultural importance and significance of a healthy, living, and thriving forest, I want to share a worldview and a concept that has been practiced and understood for thousands and thousands of years prior to the existence of what we now refer to this area of British Columbia, prior to the existence of Canada. And this is practice and understanding referred to as Heshuk Ish Tsawak, which has been practiced by the Nuu-chah-nulth people, as I said, for thousands upon thousands of years. And what Heshuk Ish Tsawak translates to English as is everything is one. And so when we begin to think in these terms of everything is connected, everything around us, every living being is connected as one, then we can begin to understand why it is so critical and why it is so important that we protect what little bit of old growth that we have remaining within what we refer to as now as British Columbia. To give just a little tiny example of Heshuk Ish Tsawak, when we talk about healthy, thriving, and living forests, we're also talking about healthy, thriving, and living rivers, creeks, and streams. When we think about these healthy and thriving, living creeks and rivers and streams, we think about the spawning salmon. When we think about the salmon, we think about the ocean. When we think about the ocean, we think about all of the living beings that rely on the ocean to survive. And so this is just a little tiny idea of this concept, Heshuk Ish Tsawak, everything is one. And it allows us to expand our mind and understand that how we treat the living things around us is going to impact everything around us. I want people to understand that all of the living beings all around what we refer to as British Columbia, every living tree, every plant, every salmon in this area, all of these areas are within the traditional territories of First Nations that have inhabited and survived and thrived off of these lands, waters, and resources for thousands upon thousands of years. These forests that have allowed us to sustain ourselves since the beginning of time, since time immemorial, are extremely important in who we are as Ku'as people. Ku'as is our word for First Nations people. When we think about British Columbia, there is 203 First Nations, distinct First Nations in British Columbia alone. And when we think about these 203 First Nations, over 90% of these First Nations are what we refer to as unceded. So they have never ever surrendered their inherent rights and title to the Crown, to British Columbia, or to Canada. And so this is really important, so that I want to share an idea that I have, and it's a belief that I think is true, and that is that Crown land doesn't exist. It's a figment of your imagination. For the very fact that over 90% of these lands within British Columbia have never ever been surrendered by the people who have occupied these lands for thousands and thousands of years. So when we enter into these small little places in our territories that have been untouched, you don't have to walk very far until you begin to see remnants of things that our ancestors did to survive and thrive right here. And that's through looking at what we refer to as CMTs, culturally modified trees. You can walk into these untouched areas and you could see parts of our history that explain how we survived and how we protected and how we treated everything around us with such respect that there's still examples to this day in Hesquiaht territory. You can walk through the forests and you'll see remnants of 1,000-year-old cedar trees that have these massive planks taken out of them. And this was harvested in a way that would allow that cedar tree to continue to live a full life. And so these practices, they give you a little insight into how much respect we had for all of the living beings around us. It's important for us to understand that the living trees and the importance of a healthy, thriving, living forest is hugely impactful on who we are as Nuu-chah-nulth people, for example. Our Nuu-chah-nulth people are all the nations on the west coast of Vancouver Island. As a Hesquiaht woman, I come from one of the 15 nations that belong to Nuu-chah-nulth. And for thousands and thousands of years, the ocean was our biggest resource. And how we got along through that ocean, the highway of our ancestors, was in cedar dugout canoes. These cedar dugout canoes are made out of cedar trees that are between the ages of 500 and 800 years old. And so if you think about now that we have very, very little areas within our territory, some have no areas at all that have these trees that remain, 500 to 800-year-old cedar trees. So if we lose access to this old growth forest, we're losing a part of who we are, who I am as a Hesquiaht woman, who I am as a Nuu-chah-nulth woman. In my lifetime, I have seen the destruction that logging has played within the Hesquiaht territory, and it's absolutely devastating. When I talk about Hesquiaht Ishtzawak and the connection between the forests, the rivers, the salmon, and the ocean. Take a ride through Hesquiaht territory one of these times. I encourage you, and you'll see the devastation we have on many of our creeks. I can think of our creeks at Yaxis, Ma'api, these creeks that salmon used to go up and spawn, and it's because of the practices of over-harvesting that these creeks they are no longer spawning grounds for salmon. So absolutely, having healthy living and thriving forests is absolutely integral to maintain our cultural livelihood as Ku'us people. And I know I only have a few minutes left, but I want to share the importance of thinking long term. I want to share the importance of getting rid of this idea of 1, 2, and 3 year plans. Growing up, my father used to think of basing all of these plans on the life cycle of a cedar tree. So instead of doing a 4-year plan on how we're going to manage our forest, we're going to do a 2,000-year plan. And that's the life cycle of a cedar tree. That cedar tree is going to live to be about 1,500 years old. When that cedar tree dies, it's going to stand there for another 200 or 300 years. As that cedar tree falls to the ground, more living things are going to come from that cedar tree. And those are the terms that we need to begin to think of if we're going to protect what little bit we have left. And that's what I want to encourage people to do. And I'm just really happy that I had the opportunity to share a few words with you folks tonight. And I'm happy to listen to the discussion, and Tleko for providing the opportunity. I'm really excited to hear what the rest of discussion tonight has. True.
Unmute myself. Thank you so much, Mariah. There was so much depth and strength in what you said, but I just want to pick out a couple of the words that really just want to reinforce for everybody, which is crown land doesn't exist. I really love that one. And the key kind of values which you're grounding us in, which is everyone is one and connected, treat everything with respect, and think long-term, have 2,000-year plans. If only we were doing that in the dominant society that we live in, it would be a different story. Thank you so much. With that wonderful beginning for us, Mariah, I'm going to just take a few more words about the format that we're using for tonight. So in addition to Mariah, we have two other speakers, Torrance Coste from Wilderness Committee and Shelley Luce from the Sierra Club of British Columbia. They're going to speak for about 15 minutes each. And so we've tried to keep clear a question period for about 25 to 30 minutes. So we're really welcoming your questions, and we're asking you to post your questions. So those of you who are used to chat box, don't use the chat box. Put your questions into the Q&A, because we have some folks monitoring the questions, and they're going to pull them together from the Q&A, not from the chat box. So I hope everybody's got that one. I maybe repeat it a little later. And I just want to note that our process in the background is supported by Aurora Tehea, who is the communications co-lead with the Sierra Club of BC, and by M. Hoffpower, who's the Vancouver Island campaigner for the Wilderness Committee. And they'll be the ones who collect and sort your questions and pass the priorities to me based on your input, so I don't have to monitor everything coming in. And so we'll take that till about 8:25, and then a little bit more on a couple of announcements and a closing appreciation to everybody. So that said, let me introduce the first speaker here, which is Torrance Coste, who is the lead campaigner with the Wilderness Committee. The committee is a nonprofit environmental group that works to protect life-giving biological diversity in Canada through strategic research, community mobilizing, and public education. And it's been around quite a while, since 1980. And has a presence in Victoria, Vancouver, Winnipeg, and Toronto, and active in many campaigns and partners with grassroots groups and First Nations and many others across the country. I got to know Torrance through the intense organizing that we did for the Old Growth Walk and Rally. And I want to say his commitment and his wisdom run deep. And he's a fellow who has his boots on the ground. He knows the territory whereof he speaks, the territories he travels, the backcountry of this province, as does his co-worker, M. So yeah, welcome, Torrance. Over to you.
Thanks so much for that introduction. Thanks again to Mariah for those opening words, Kleko. And thanks to all of you for being here. I work full time. I'm lucky to work full time on this issue, and any time I can gather, ideally in a room, or if not on Zoom, with a couple hundred other people who are passionate about this. It's really great. I'm calling in from my home on the territories of the Malahat and Cowichan peoples, and as Mariah spoke to, all forests in what we call BC grow on the territory of one of the 203 nations here, and it's critical that we keep that sort of front of mind when we're having these discussions. All right, I'm going to run through fairly quickly a sort of snapshot of how we got here, how we got to this place in almost June 2023, and sort of set the stage for those of you that are really keen and follow this issue closely. Some of this will be a bit of a review, but this is important context to have. It's important to sort of have this timeline so that we can have this context in mind when we're speaking about this issue to our friends and neighbors and to our MLAs to put pressure on them. So the slide that's up there now is the cover of the Old Growth Strategic Review report. In 2019, 2 years after being elected, the BC NDP ordered the Old Growth Strategic Review, which was a 2-person panel that undertook the most extensive review of forest policy in BC history. Their report was given to the government in the spring of 2020 and released publicly thereafter in September of 2020. That's the first sort of key date to hold, September 2020. The report classified status quo forestry as unsustainable and called for a total paradigm shift in the forests here. And it made 14 recommendations about how to achieve this paradigm shift. For the most part, the recommendations were and remain solid. They were congratulated, and for the most part, they are good steps forward to a better future. But the problem is the delivery of them. A key piece that's been massively downplayed by the province since then is that the OGSR also laid out a fairly strict 3-year timeline over which the recommendations should be begun or in some cases completed. And this is where the NDP government has fallen far short. Starting the clock in September 2020, which is generous because that's when they released the report, not when they got it. But starting the clock then, the 3-year timeline ends in just over 3 months, and none of the recommendations have been completed, and many of them haven't even been started. A good example, and maybe the most well-known example of this slow progress, is around recommendation 6, which calls for immediate deferral of logging in at-risk old growth forests. The NDP accompanied the OGSR report with a series of deferral areas, which are temporary 2-year holds enabled by something called a Part 13 order under the Forest Act. In September 2020, the province announced deferrals in 9 areas, which were large and in some cases well-known areas like Clayoquot Sound, but they were quite varied. Huge portions of these areas were either second growth, non-forested, so cliffs, mountains, swamps. They were already protected, or they contained areas that were technically old growth, but not what's scientifically defined as at risk or ecologically productive old growth forests. High on mountain slopes or in coastal bogs, these ecosystems are still important, but they are slower the trees are slower growing. They tend to be small and stunted, and therefore less sought after by the logging industry. And there is a lot of them still left because they haven't been targeted by logging for the last 100 years. So only a few thousand hectares of these original deferral areas can be classified as ecologically at-risk old growth. Fast forward almost a year and you get the headline that's on the screen now. The Band Council of the Hesquiaht Nation requested the deferral of 2 areas, the Central Walbrand Valley and Fairy Creek. At this point, the RCMP was arresting dozens of people almost daily at areas around Fairy Creek, the Kaikous Valley, and the NDP government was getting bad press around the world and was desperate to change the channel. So they quickly accepted these deferrals. Next slide. Back to that one. The Part 13 order for the Central Walbrand had been drafted with the original 9 Part 13 orders from the previous September, which the government has indicated have been extended. And so they're in place until September 2024. Fairy Creek, on the other hand, the Part 13 order there went into effect when it was declared, which means it's up for expiry on June 8th of this year, which is next Thursday. There's been no indication whether this will be extended or if it will expire. And the situation at Fairy Creek really highlights the lack of transparency around this process. At the same time, the province was accepting these small yet important deferral requests at Walbrand and Fairy Creek. The province moved to defend against the criticism that it hadn't done enough to safeguard these kinds of ecologically valuable big tree old growth forests across BC. Next slide. Later in June 2021, the NDP government set up a second panel, the Old Growth Technical Advisory Panel, to determine what exactly at-risk old growth is. I just want to pause here and note the fact that it took the NDP more than a year after receiving the first report from the first panel to begin acting on recommendation 6, which was supposed to be immediate. That doesn't really align with their claims that they grasp the urgency of this crisis and that they're doing everything they can as quickly as they can. The technical advisory panel, on the other hand, did work quite quickly and got their report and their mapping to government within months. And in early November 2021, the government released their work, which recommended deferral in 2.6 million hectares of old growth forest in BC. Now, forests, we talk about them in hectares, but it's hard to picture 2.6 million hectares or 11 million hectares of total old growth or 56 million hectares. Envisioning a single hectare can be hard, and envisioning millions of them, I just find it doesn't relate to people. So we made a chart to kind of break this into percentages, and that's the next slide. As you can see here, this is, I'll explain the layers. The big yellow layer is unprotected second and third growth forest and other young forest. You can see the vast majority of forest in BC isn't protected, and it's not old growth. The light green slice is protected forest that isn't old growth, so second and third growth forests that have since been put into parks or younger forests of other types. The dark green slice is protected old growth, and that red slice that's sort of pulled out, that is the remaining unprotected old growth in BC. Of that, 2/3 are defined as ecologically at risk, and about half of that is what the technical panel called for deferral of. So all of the sort of fuss or the claims from the logging industry that the government was coming for all the old growth, they don't totally stack up when you look at the math. It's under 5% of the total area. So these deferral areas address the problem with the original ones, in that the original ones didn't cover the most ecologically important forests, but they are deeply flawed in their own right for a number of reasons. Number one is they didn't come into effect right away. They weren't immediate, despite the news headlines that the province had stopped logging in 1/3 of all old growth forests. They have slowly trickled in as band councils across the province have agreed to them. And in the meantime, a great deal has been logged, and my colleague Shelley will get into that a bit later. The second problem is they don't have Part 13 orders. They're in essence voluntary on the part of the tenure holder, which for the most part in BC is a handful of large corporations. And because they don't have Part 13 orders, they have no maps, they have no timeline or expiry date. We can't tell when they came into effect. So there's essentially no accountability around them. To date, the government has stated that it's completed deferrals over 2.1 million hectares of old growth, but they've provided almost no detail. Outside of the original 9 areas, the Walbran and Fairy Creek, no maps have been released, and there's been zero indication of which areas were deferred when those areas will expire, or exactly how much of that 2.1 million hectares is within the 2.6 million hectares that's that kind of top light red slice on that pie chart, the best of the best old growth. So the Fairy Creek deferral is getting a lot of attention, as it should. It's an incredibly important ecosystem in a beautiful place that thousands of people put their bodies on the line to defend, but it's also less than 0.1% of the forest the NDP has claimed it's taken action on. And the same uncertainty is the norm right across BC. So this is really frustrating. If the best 2 million hectares of old growth were temporarily set aside, the government was engaging with First Nations to turn these areas into permanently protected forests. This would be significant progress from where we were a few years ago. The problem is there's no indication that that's what's happening. For the most part, we don't know where the deferrals are, and we don't know, and as such, we don't know if they've actually stopped that much logging or whether they've just been implemented in places that weren't going to be logged in the first place. What's more, there have been no updates on any progress or even what the government's plan is towards permanent protection. After all, deferrals are not the end solution. They're not, the beach that you sit on and have a margarita after a job well done. They're the life raft that makes getting back to land possible. And so, they're held up as this sort of end thing, but they're very much meant to be a stopgap. And that makes it all the more frustrating that progress has been so limited. So Old Growth Strategic Review Recommendation 6 was about the deferrals, but number 5 was about public information and transparency, which can also be only be seen as a failure so far. We're approaching the 3-year deadline, and there's so much uncertainty about what government is doing, what's been set aside, what the plan is moving forward. Of course, there's a straight line between the lack of transparency and the lack of ambition and action. If the government had accomplished a lot, if they had solid indicators of progress and solid concrete plans to do the rest, they would talk about that. But they haven't, they don't have those things, and so they aren't. After releasing the technical panel's work on where the best forests are, again, late 2021, the province has for the most part positioned itself as a neutral party, which in this case isn't the right move. The Old Growth Strategic Review found the system has an entrenched bias towards prioritizing timber over all other values, and reversing that means the government needs to take a bias towards conservation, and we're just not seeing that. Every tree in BC, again, grows on the territory of a First Nation, but the old growth is where it is. It's so depleted because the provincial government has allowed, facilitated, and incentivized the logging of these forests. This problem is their responsibility to fix. So I'll close with a glimmer of hope or a potential warning, maybe a bit of both. Next slide. The NDP government is currently working on a progress aligned to Old Growth Strategic Review Recommendation 2, which is to prioritize ecosystem health and biodiversity in all decisions, rather than continue to prioritize timber, which is what they found is the status quo. They prioritize ecosystem health and biodiversity and fit all other values in after that. We know the province is developing a framework around this, which we know will be released sometime later this summer or early fall. The question is, will this contain more teeth and spur real action on the ground, or will it be another delay tactic that leads to more talk and log? My colleague Shelley will get into a little bit more about what we're hoping to see and what we're warning about in that process. But I encourage everyone to monitor government announcements, not for glossy language or even additional plans, but for action that both protects forest on the ground and swiftly delivers the money to communities so that the route of deferring logging and planning for permanent conservation comes with benefits. Next slide. These are some of the stark realities to convey when talking about old growth. Again, whether that's to your neighbor or your family or to your MLA or a member of government, because despite the flashy announcements, not a lot looks different out in the woods. Old growth continues to fall. The money to offset the cost of deferrals and support planning towards permanent protection, these things aren't in place, and the subtle tone of the government around being a neutral party, around just kind of sitting back and waiting and see what happens, as opposed to being a champion for conservation, that's missing, and that's what needs to change. I am going to pass it back to Jackie now. I hope this helped provide a little reminder or snapshot about where things are at, and I look forward to discussion and questions later on. Thank you. You're still on mute, Jackie.
Unmute, I know. Thank you so much, Torrance. And that was a lot to pack into a pretty sobering report with a little possible glimmer of hope at the end. We always hold out for hope. We need to nowadays, I think. So I'd like to now introduce Shelley Luce, who's the Director of Campaigns for Sierra Club of British Columbia, which it has her involved in supporting biodiversity and healthy ecosystems by protecting forests and by advocating for strong climate action. The Sierra Group is dedicated to protecting 30% of BC land and waters by 2030 and keeping old growth forests standing through Indigenous-led conservation programs. It's a nonprofit environmental charity whose core mission is to advance climate justice and ecosystem protection by uplifting grassroots-led change. And they're committed to learning from diverse communities and diverse communities and knowledge systems, in particular those of the Indigenous nations on whose territories Sierra lives and works. I'm just getting to know Shelley, so I can't say so much about her, but I welcome her to this webinar and look forward to a fruitful relationship over time. Hi, Shelley.
Hi, thank you very much, Jackie. I am calling in from the territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples, and I am really honored to be talking with so many of you this evening and with my colleagues on this webinar. I'm going to get into some detail on the status of old growth logging right now. To the best of our knowledge, as Torrance said, transparency and public information are not something that I think have been improved a lot since the OGSR recommendations were released. But we do have some information to talk about, and then talk about what's needed next, what our next steps are to get to protection. So as Torrance referred to, there are some deferrals in place, but the bad news is that overall rates of logging have not actually slowed. In April last year, 2022, a coalition, including Sierra Club and Wilderness Committee, among others, released data showing that logging had occurred in the very high priority old growth forests identified in the OGSR. And while that information is hard to find in government reports, et cetera, we can tell actually from satellite photos and from on the ground visits to different locations that this has actually been going on in the high priority old growth that really was on the urgent list for deferrals. Also, that cutting permits are still being submitted for remaining high priority areas, applications to cut. And in fact, there are cut blocks pending at that time, 18 months ago. So that was about a year and a half into the 3-year plan to implement the deferrals. So feeling a lot of urgency around that. And then at the end of 2022, we were disappointed by the government's claim that the rate of old growth logging had reached a record low, which was a pretty disingenuous claim, considering that the government's own data showed that the area, the hectares logged in 2021, was only marginally less than the areas logged in 2020 or 2019. So this means that the year the government commitment to defer old growth logging was made, there was no substantial difference in the actual area logged. And this claim that it had reached a record low was really talking about a sliver of a percentage less than prior years. So it's one of the claims that we have to be aware of when we see that language in government announcements. And then this year, by March 2023, some further progress had been made and a number of important deferrals are now in place. So that's the good news. Government announced this as 2.1 million hectares deferred, but as we already mentioned, those deferrals are mainly not in the most at-risk areas. And so we're still looking, if you think of that pie chart, for protection for that smallest slice, that 4.6% of overall forested area. Next slide, please. And so what are the next steps that we need to think about? Well, one of them is funding, and funding is a big part of the solution here for some really, really good reasons. Money is needed to advance both the short-term and long-term old growth protection because there are communities in British Columbia that are partly or wholly dependent on logging for revenues. There are Indigenous nations who now rely on logging revenues. There are rural communities without a lot of other economic development. There are legal contracts government has signed to allow cutting for corporate profit and other reasons for how we got to this place. Next slide, please. So we need to be very clear about what funding is needed and what it's needed for. The short-term funding needed for deferrals, to put the deferrals in place on the highest risk old growth, is about $100 million from the provincial government. And this funding is to replace revenues for communities who have depended on logging. And it's the #1 priority to move those forests into deferrals. And this would actually replace revenues just for a couple of years to give the breathing space to make a plan for economic transition. As Torrance said, it's the life raft, it's not the beach. Next slide, please. This next slide is about long-term conservation financing, and the need for that is much greater. The funding need for that is much greater. Generally, it's agreed that the provincial government needs to commit about 300 million to match 300 million in federal funding. And many folks are working hard to raise an equal sum of 300 million from private and philanthropic sources. And the need for this really ties to the conversation about biodiversity and ecosystem health, because there are many benefits to a healthy forest that we currently do not value monetarily, and therefore we do not protect. So the paradigm shift that the OGSR talks about and that we all talk about involves learning new and relearning old ways, similar to what, and including what Mariah referred to as far as how trees have been used by Indigenous people. So different ways of living with our forests so that forests and people can thrive. And tangible ways of doing this include more selective harvesting, non-timber harvesting of other things like mushrooms and berries and essential oils and materials for making non-timber products. Tourism is another really important activity that provides an economic benefit, and also I think really helps because it can provide really life-changing educational experiences for people who may not otherwise interact with some of the ecosystems and natural environments that we're talking about. And also carbon storage, if it's done right, carbon can be converted to revenue so that people can, communities can be supported for keeping trees standing and keeping forests healthy. There's also a lot of restoration that needs to be done, and that can provide excellent jobs as well. And all of this is looking toward what Suzanne Simard, for example, and many others call the restoration economy. And this would be a much more sustainable economically and ecologically than what we have been doing. So one of the reasons I wanted to elaborate on all of that, and anyone on our panel and others in the audience can add to that as well, I know, but it's just to put those numbers in perspective. We're looking at 900 million, maybe $1 billion over a long period of time to transition communities, to transition all of British Columbia from an economy that has relied entirely on extraction to one that can be restorative and regenerative and sustainable. So where are we in getting all this funding, which is needed for the next step? It's really hard to pinpoint exactly what the BC government has committed to so far as funding goes, because there's no one pot of money labeled for deferrals or for old growth. Instead, that money is embedded in wider programs. So the government recently has committed a few $100 million to funding for impacted workers and industry and communities. So when pulp mills close or when forests are taken off the chopping block, so to speak, money to support those communities, or for manufacturing higher value wood products instead of the raw log exports, or to support forest landscape planning, for example, with First Nations. So all of those pots of money have portions that could go to what we're talking about here, but none of them guarantee that old growth will not be logged. So it's a little bit hard to say exactly where the province is in providing either the short-term or the long-term financing that's needed. Next slide, please. I want to call back to the ecosystem health and biodiversity discussion that we've touched on a couple of times, because this is the second recommendation in the old growth strategic review recommendations, and it is a big part of the paradigm shift. I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on where it is right now. The provincial government has done a number of consultations with, I would call them, they've had a lot of workshops, I guess, and a lot of the environmental groups, many First Nations and other Indigenous communities, as well as industry and academics have participated in these. And we are expecting, we're told that in June, we will have a draft framework around ecosystem health and biodiversity and how we might implement legislation. This is really exciting to me because we don't have a Species at Risk Act for the province. We don't have something like the Endangered Species Act that you hear about from the United States. So we have species at risk. We know that we're getting down to the last few. They're not sustainable populations. We don't have a specific way to protect them. A legislation framework around ecosystem health and biodiversity could take a very holistic view. So rather than protecting one species, we're talking about ecosystem health, which is a very broad and holistic way to approach it. So I find it very exciting that the province is taking this approach. And of course, I'm very concerned about where the province might take it. There's a lot of pressure to water it down and make sure it has no teeth, that pressure coming from industry, et cetera. And so the environmental groups, the coalition that we work with, has requested that the framework and the eventual legislation include 3 really important things. One is science-based ecosystem targets. So that means if you're going to protect ecosystem health, you have to identify specific things that we know are indicators of that health. You can't say we have a healthy ecosystem, don't worry that the caribou aren't coming back, or don't worry that the murrelet's gone, as well as other targets more related to biodiversity. What's the abundance of different species? How many different species are present here? That kind of thing. Conservation financing is the other one, which we just discussed, and legislated protected areas, because we know that this is this gives us the durability. This is what makes sure that those protected areas stay protected. And we're talking about IPCAs, Indigenous protected and conserved areas, maybe other mechanisms as well. And so finally, next slide, please. One thing to put this in context is that implementing the recommendations in the Old Growth Strategic Review is a commitment that was made alongside other government commitments. It's easy for government to tie that to logging and jobs and industry, and oh, we're going to lose this, we're going to lose that if we implement these recommendations. But actually, there are equally important commitments that the province has made to conservation and protecting 30% of land and waters by the year 2030. To biodiversity with that legislation I just mentioned, to reconciliation and justice for Indigenous peoples. So if we don't implement the OGSR, where does that leave us on these other really important promises and commitments that the government has made? Is a question that I think it's fair for all of us to ask. So on our next slide, we're looking to cut through the spin and call for accountability with the provincial government by following up on funding commitments. The last we heard was a statement in February of this year. The government said that there is money in the works, can't give us a number. Their announcement was that there will be funding forthcoming, but we don't know when. So we are watching for it. I think we were expecting something in June, an announcement. And same month, another announcement on the ecosystem health and biodiversity framework. So now I would like to turn this back over to Jackie, and I look forward to our Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Shelley. I'm really glad that you went into the ecosystem health question too. It was important that we bring that in. So there's some energy of possibility in the sense that language is changing. And so when language changes, the frameworks begin to change, but we still have a lot to wait for in terms of actual action. So I'm going to talk very briefly about action because I hope that both of these presentations have reinforced for you that now is not the time to let up on the pressure in terms of the actual process around the OGSR. And indeed, I would say the very opposite. So September 11th marks the 3rd anniversary of a promise made to implement the OGSR in 3 years. And as Torrance said, not one of the recommendations has been fully implemented. So we're not going to let this pass without a clear message. We're not standing down from our defense of old growth. We will not, as the song goes, we will not stand down. So we have a vision of a big, bold day or perhaps week of action throughout the province in September to mark this 3-year anniversary, calling on the MLAs and the government to act now. We've done it before, we'll keep doing it, and we'll keep doing it until we don't need to do it anymore. And we imagine that these actions could be led by communities. So we're not trying to define the nature of what would happen in different communities, because we're hoping that individuals and local groups will step up on their own with the kind of brilliant creative ideas that we saw in the Old Growth Rally and we've seen in so many places throughout the province. As ways of finding ways to communicate more deeply about the importance of old growth forests. So we will be calling on the 200 plus 250, I can't remember now, signatories that we have for the United for Old Growth. We'll call on those folks to hopefully plan their own initiatives and to work with others in their communities. And the 4 groups that collaborated, who initiated the declaration, which is Wilderness, Sierra, Stand.earth, and the Elders for Ancient Trees. We'll be doing some of our own organizing, but we'll also be collaborating too. So what we can say to you is stay tuned for a key date for action in the month of September, and there's more to come. And if you want to take action and need a little support, you can contact us at, and we'll put this in the chat box, unitedforoldgrowth@gmail.com. When you do that, send us your name, your email, and either your riding or your postal code, so we kind of know where you are in the province. That'd be great if you do that. So we're just exactly where we wanted to be on time. I just want to assure you of that. And we're going to move into the Q&A. So I already have a bunch of questions coming. So I'm going to read the question and see which of you wants to take the question, and leave a little bit of time for secondary take up, but let's not have all 3 answering all questions, so we won't get through this long list. So the first one is one that relates to your presentation, Torrance. The pie chart is from Marianne. The pie chart includes 6% protected and about 13% unprotected old growth. Does that mean there is 20% old growth in BC? I thought we were down to less than 3%.
Yeah, thanks for this question. Because of the speed which I moved through my presentation, I moved too quickly over a couple of things, and this is one of them. The short answer is that both are right, 3% and 20%. The provincial definition of old growth is forests over 250 years old on the coast, or 140 years old in the interior. Those are the accepted provincial definitions. They're not always perfect, right? They're based on tree age. So if there's, you know, a stand of forest that has a couple 1,500-year-old yellow cedars, and then because of the elevation or the slope of the hill, all the other trees are 200 years old, then the average is going to be below 250, and that might not be classified as an old growth forest. We see a lot of forests classified not as old growth in places like Fairy Creek, despite the fact that the watershed's never been logged. So this pie chart works on that definition, and by that definition, there is 20%, about a fifth of all forested area meets that qualification of old growth. The problem is the vast majority of it is not what anyone associates with the term old growth. When you close your eyes and picture an old growth forest, right? People picture massive trees in the Carmanah Valley or the Walbran. People think about Fairy Creek or Clayoquot Sound. People think about the Nkamapla in the interior, Stein Valley in the Fraser Canyon. They think about these iconic forests with massive trees, high biodiversity, the highly productive ecosystems that are so critical for Indigenous cultural resources, for biodiversity, for spiritual values, and they're also sought after by the logging industry because of the tall, straight trees filled with wood. So it's to the point now when we're going to check out an old growth forest, half the time we take pictures, we post them, and we come home and say, oh, you know, visiting old growth forest here in Quagioth territory, and a bunch of the comments are, that's not old growth, that tree's not as wide as your shoulders are, that one tree is only as thick as your leg, that's not old growth. And it is. Old growth trees can be as thick as your arm if they grow way up the side of a mountain facing north and they're covered in snow from October till June. They won't be the size of a massive western red cedar at low elevation in the Walbran Valley. The 2%, 3%, sometimes you hear 1%, those numbers come from different ways of classifying old growth. Those numbers are paired with a category called site index, which is essentially a tree height inventory. So the highest site index is site index 25, which means forests where the trees are 25 meters tall or higher at 50 years old. And of that very highest category, there's only a couple 100,000 hectares remaining unlogged. That's where the 1% remaining. That 3% I believe is from site index 20 and up. I include these numbers because the technical advisory panel work, that's where these percentages come from. and their work is based, it incorporates site index. It also includes ecosystem type. It skews where forests are heavily logged in a certain part of the province. So say, southern Vancouver Island, there'd be more at risk because more has been logged than there is, say, in the far northwest. So the 4.6% is what they've called for deferral. The 8.9%, so just under 9%, is what they've categorized as ecologically at risk. But that number, the total remaining old growth and the protected old growth, they both skew heavily towards that less productive old growth forest. So think, swampy old growth with smaller trees way up the sides of mountains. Again, these I don't like talking about them in this term. I don't like using the term productive because it feels like we're disvaluing them. They do still have value. They are still important, but when the fuss is over a much smaller number, it's over about 5% of the forest remaining in BC. And that's where kind of that discrepancy comes from. I'll drop my email in the chat. I'm always trying to figure out better, more clear ways to talk this through. I apologize for any confusion that I've caused or contributed to tonight. And yeah, shoot me an email and we can talk it out. Thanks.
Thanks, Torrance. I think that was a plant, that question, so that you could get another 5 minutes for your presentation. That's great. That's pretty amazing.
It was from my mom, I confess.
No, it's pretty amazing how much you can cover in a few minutes of the accumulated experience of trying to make sense of what is going on here, which I know is difficult. So there's a couple other questions that have to do with numbers. So I'm going to actually, because it's probably going to be you, Torrance, I think, ask you to respond to them quickly if you can. This is a big one, this one. How much logging today on 1, virgin forest, 2, second generation growth, 3, third generation forest? Do you have any idea?
It's very regionally variable, right? So on some places, say southeastern Vancouver Island, almost none would be in old growth because there's almost no old growth remaining. Other parts of the province, say northwestern Vancouver Island, it would be almost all old growth. I believe the provincial average is about 25 to 30% of all logging is in old growth forest, with the rest in second and third growth.
Mm-hmm. Which is pretty significant, actually. That's really important. Thank you, Torrance. Okay, so I'm going to give this one to you, Shelley. If you don't want it, that's fine. But what does deferral areas mean, and why are they in place? So this is an expression of, there's different folks on this webinar, and some people know more than others, and we throw around the word deferral without giving context for it. So
yeah, thank you. That is a great question. Deferrals are areas that may have been slated for logging, or at least are not protected from logging, that then have the ability to log there is deferred. So it's a bit of a twisted backward way of looking at it. But the reason we use defer is because it's not necessarily permanent. It may become permanent protection, but it's actually short-term. Maybe a 2-year deferral is what we're looking at under the OGSR recommendations. And what it means is that it's not taken off the market, so be it forever, but it gives the province and communities who live and rely, or on whose territory that forest is, 2 years to decide if they want to make a different plan for that forest.
Okay, thanks, Shelley. I'm going to actually follow up with you too, because you spoke to this, but Torrance may want to add. The question is, what's up with provincial and federal funding for conservation financing? Now, you spoke to that a bit in relation to the province, but maybe you might have something to say about federal and what's happening between the province and the federal government around that. And why is it taking so long? As if you know the answer.
Yeah, I don't really know why it's taking so long, except that it's money, and it's hard to squeeze it out of 2 different parties, 3 different groups. And also there are other people who are part of the negotiations, and I'm not, so I can't give you any inside information on that. But I do know that the federal government has committed, and I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but in the hundreds of millions, and is prepared to move forward on a nature agreement, is what I'm hearing. And so the federal and provincial governments need to decide and agree with each other on how much each group is going to contribute to that nature agreement. And then that will be conservation financing. That money will be for conservation financing. And I hope, and please, if someone else on the call knows this better than me, I hope that it will be labeled for that. Remember, we said there's money in different pots that the provincial government has committed. You could take some of this for what we're talking about, you could take some of that pot. It would be great if there was something labeled conservation financing. This is going to deferrals. This is going to Indigenous protected and conserved areas and economic transition for rural communities, specifically to conserve and protect old growth. That would be ideal. But please, Torrance or Mariah, if you'd like to contribute.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. Are you okay, Torrance and Mariah, on that one? Great. So I'm actually going to break the questions that have been being fed. That's because I want to ask Mariah a question, which is when I was learning a little bit more about your nation, I went to the nation's website, and on the website, the following was written, and I thought that other folks might like to know this, and maybe you'd like to speak to it for a moment if you'd like to, which is the Hesquiaht First Nation no longer accepts the colonialist practice of clear-cut logging within their territories in the Clayoquot Sound, a method that logs trees across vast swaths of land. Clear-cut methods are not sustainable as they damage the watershed, destroy habitat, disrupt the salmon cycle, and damage the rainforest. So I wonder if you'd like to speak a little bit to what your nation has been standing up doing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jackie. So literally my entire life, the family I belong to, the House of Kinquashtakum, we've been standing up against this type of logging literally since I was born, my 35 years of life. This is something that we've been standing up against. And I kind of explained a little bit too, is we can see the devastation in our Hesquiaht territory. When the very first settlers came to the west coast of Canada, they really believed, they said, oh, these lands are untouched because of how well we took care of our forests. And if you were to go into Hesquiaht territory now, you will see the devastation on all of the mountainsides. You will see massive, massive clear cuts on the sides of our mountains. As I mentioned, the majority of our streams, creeks, and rivers, they're no longer salmon-bearing streams. And so that's a direct result of clear-cut logging. And so I'm really happy to come from a nation that has stood up and made a stance and said, we're done with it. And it's something that we're going to continue to fight, because industry has, they have a lot of interesting ways of getting what they want. When you're hanging dollar signs to a community that has very little economic opportunity. And when we're dealing with chief and band council systems, which has been imposed through the Indian Act, and then we have the hereditary system, those two don't always align. And we have seen time and time again where industry does whatever it is that they can to go and get what they are after. But I'm proud to say that I'm from a nation that has said enough is enough. It's time that we stand up against industry, and it's time that we protect what little bit that we have left, and allow that old growth to remain intact for our future generations.
Great. Thank you so much, Mariah. And I appreciate at least a little bit your use of the word interesting to describe how they hold the money up. It was very kind of you to say that. I'm sure you could have said something much stronger. So your little description of your nation feeds right into the next question, which is, are there good examples or best practices in supporting Indigenous communities meaningfully move away from economic dependence on settler colonial extractive industries? So maybe we could just have a few examples brought in. I'm conscious of our time here, but I don't know who'd like to go first, but examples in addition to the Hesquiaht Nation. Go ahead, Mariah.
I hope it's okay that I go first, but a good example is I used to tour people around Hesquiaht territory in traditional dugout canoe built by Joe Martin, a master carver. And literally what my summertime job was is I took people through the territory. I took people through the territory and I took them to the Big Tree Trail. And we walked through this ancient forest. We saw 1,000-year-old cedar trees. And this is an area now that it's being protected by the Hesquiaht people. And the Hesquiaht people were able to protect this area of land back in the late 80s because they said, hey, BC, hey, Canada, we've never ever surrendered our territories. Our history lies within our forests and we can prove it to you in the highest courts. And they did that. They proved that their history is right within that forest. They said, hey, BC, hey, Canada, if you ever want to sign a treaty with us, if you ever want to sign an agreement with us with our land, then you will be erasing our history by cutting down those trees. And so an example of our forests making money, economic benefit is exactly that, is I literally toured people around the Hesquiaht territory and brought them to the Big Tree Trail. And that's it's living, and people get to go and visit and they learn the story and they see the significance. And I think that's just a beautiful way of how the Hesquiaht people have been able to maintain some of their beautiful, beautiful territory and allow them to be the real storytellers of how they've been able to preserve that area in the world, and sharing that story with people from all across. There's people from all over the world that visit that area and learn about that history.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mariah. Thank you for that very vivid description. And it also reinforces, I think, what we've learned over and over again, which is it's not easy to fight for the forests if people don't spend time in the forests and really develop the relationships that are needed. So Torrance or Shelley, do you want to give examples? Shelley, I think you're ready.
Yeah, we mentioned a couple earlier on, and one that I think I didn't mention is the potential for sustainable seafood harvesting, because there are ways that have been used for a very long time to harvest different kinds of seafood and salmon without destroying the populations of those creatures. And so I would be very excited if I knew that I could source some of my protein from a sustainable harvest from an indigenous operated business on an indigenous territory. That's just one example.
Thank you, Shelley. Torrance, do you have an example you'd like to share?
I was going to say pretty much the same thing as Shelley.
Okay, great.
We both like seafood, apparently.
Right. And I hope we're also all working on our practicing eating more kelp. I was working on that myself the last little while. The marble murrelet has been in the news a lot, and its preservation is an issue. What are the chances that the preservation of this and other endangered species will help preserve some of the last rainforests here? So they're asking you to speculate, I think, on the quartz here, but go for it if you're willing to.
I can jump in quickly, and you know, it's a path and a hopeful one, but there needs to be more progress at strengthening the laws. The existing laws just aren't strong enough, and you know, you don't have to look far, you know, just across to the Lower Mainland, for those of you that are there, at another old growth dependent bird, the spotted owl, right? It's down to just one wild born owl remaining in the wild in BC, and there isn't the legal grounds yet to halt the logging in its territory. The provincial government continues to approve logging, so it's hopeful, but the answer, before the laws can be used to protect old growth, they need to be made a bit stronger.
Right, and if I can just add something myself too, there's an initiative just in the last month or so by a group called the Friends of Fairy Creek, who are using they're going to court using the Migratory Birds Act. I think that's not quite the right title, but trying to use that one. So we'll see. So I guess the answer is we don't know, but we can be hopeful. Okay, so this is another one for you, Mariah. Many British Columbians are confused about the frequent conflict between band councils and hereditary chiefs over old growth logging. What's your advice on how settlers can play a constructive role to help bridge gaps so we don't lose everything before we figure this out? And there was a specific question about what this means in the Fairy Creek area, which you may not wish to speak to, but I'm just letting you know that that was also a specific question. Over to you, Mariah.
Yeah, this is hugely important, and we're going to see this come up time and time again. As I mentioned, the chief and council system, it's an imposed governance system that came from the Indian Act. It's a direct result of the Indian Act. And so, as we know, chief and council and our hereditary leadership are two different things. There are some First Nations that have really good relationships with the two, where they work hand in hand and they do everything together. I see that within our Nuu-chah-nulth territories and within our Nuu-chah-nulth nations. And there are other examples where they don't necessarily get along. And my best advice, honestly, is speak to the people. Speak to the people from that nation. Find out what's really going on the ground, and create relationships. Be open. Come in a respectful way. I think the best thing is really creating relationships and finding out what's happening on the ground. This isn't an easy answer though. I'm just being honest, because every nation is going to be so different. But understanding that we have governance systems that predate the existence of Canada by thousands and thousands of years, and these traditional governance systems are still very alive and well in many of our territories. And so for many of our people, that is the ultimate law, and the ultimate jurisdiction and the ultimate title holders still lay within our hectares. Our hectares is our word for our hereditary chiefs in Nuu-chah-nulth territory. So understanding the ideas and the concepts that the hectares have is going to be extremely important. But being respectful in that approach, and I know that it's not necessarily easy to work your way into those conversations and discussions, but it starts off with being present, being respectful, having an open heart and an open mind, and speaking to the people directly from that nation, and finding out the true values and views of the hectares, the traditional and the hereditary chiefs and leaders, because as I mentioned, that is our traditional governance system, and those are the inherent rights and title holders of our territories.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mariah, and thank you for the clarity of what you're saying, including the fact that it's complicated. There's no one thing fits all for this. I'm going to just jump down one of the questions here, just letting you know this, Em. If Fairy Creek is a Part 13, this is a more technical question, is a Part 13 deferral, and we know that Central Walbran, from a letter from a ministry official, is extended to March 1st, 2024. Why isn't it clear that Fairy Creek is also extended until this date at least? This may very well relate to the previous question that Mariah was addressing, but Torrance, do you want to speak to this?
Sure, yeah, I had a longer section in my presentation about this, but I cut it for length, and I guess I shouldn't have. Essentially, the Walbran, that Part 13 order was originally drafted as part of the original deferral areas announced in September 2020. It wasn't finalized then, but it was when it was called for about 10 months later by the Hesquiaht Band Council government, along with the Fairy Creek. So the Part 13 order for the Walbran began in 2020. So its expiry date was 2022, and it was since extended to 2024. The Fairy Creek one, on the other hand, the Part 13 order was written when it was requested in June 2021, and that's why it's set to expire next week.
Okay. And there's no indication of whether that will be extended?
Not that I've heard, no.
Okay, all right. The next question, now this is like a big board question. So we'll keep this short, please, the answer. Come the next election, the NDP will say that the BC United will destroy the environment. Is there any reason to trust the NDP over the Liberals or vice versa regarding old growth logging? Okay, so you only have like 1 minute answers each here. On this. Go ahead, Shelley, you want to go first?
No, because I don't really have a good answer. I'm sorry to say.
Fair enough. That's good and clear. Torrance?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard case, right? We campaigned for years against the BC Liberals, now called BC United, and they did nothing on this issue. But the reality is we've been logging old growth for decades, and in the last few decades, the NDP has been in power more. And so it is a tough argument that they'll do more on this. The current initiatives are interesting and encouraging. An ecosystem framework could be positive. The fact we're talking about old growth, but you know, the proof is in the track record, and both major parties have extremely poor records on this.
Right. Maria, do you want to add to that? Mariah, sorry.
Honestly, I think that I'm in Shelley's position here. It's really difficult. I mean, we haven't seen any type of positive movement at all. When I look at Hesquiaht territory, I'm saddened. I'm really saddened. So looking at those two parties, it's hard for me to say anything positive, just to be perfectly honest and blunt. That's
okay. Honesty and bluntness is necessary in this struggle. It has been all along, I think. Thank you for that. So now that's sort of from the big board questions to zoning in. We cannot cut a tree in our garden when it is a certain size. Why are the logging companies not being checked out? Why they have to show to regulating bodies what they cut, how much, and where. So this is about internal accountability also. I guess this would be a Torrance or Shelley question, whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? If a building is 150 years old, it's zoned as a heritage building, right? Whereas trees 10 times that age are still open for logging. It doesn't make any sense. The industry calls it self-sustainable. They call it silviculture. That the license where Fairy Creek is called a tree farm. What other farmer insists on access on being allowed to cut a crop it didn't plant? None, right? If a wheat farmer cuts a crop they didn't plant, they're called a wheat thief. And companies are allowed to cut down trees they didn't plant, and that it predate Canada many times over. So it's extremely frustrating, and this is where a paradigm shift and sort of a shift in view is needed.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Torrance. Shelley, did you want to add to that?
No, I don't have anything to add to that. Thank you, Torrance.
Great. Okay, thank you. It's obvious the BC government cannot defend any decisions that are made to preserve old growth. They're not interested in defending the forest as it's an important source of income for the province. Thinking about stumpage fees and a few other things. What are some alternative ways to preserve these forests? So that's a really big question. So again, I'm going to ask you to maybe express one or two ideas. And whoever wants to go first. Alternative ways to preserve these forests. I mean, some of them you've already spoken to, Shelley, in your proposal around Indigenous protected conservation areas or whatever. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, and that is a really big focus, because that is in many ways the right way, I believe, and the best way to do it is through programs that are led by Indigenous nations on their own territories. So that is the number one way that Sierra Club is pursuing a non-government pathway, and it isn't even non-government. It's actually usually requires cooperation from a number of different parties, including government and nations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Shelley. Torrance, do you want to add to this, or Mariah?
A reason why there's sort of so much fuss paid to what the government is doing and you know, clearing up what they've said versus what they've done on the ground is because it is a tangible a tangible route in terms of getting these laws permanently changed. That said, there has been a rich history of when that doesn't work, of direct action in BC, right? From the war in the woods in the 90s to the more recent movement around Fairy Creek and the Kaikous Valley. You know, I think that awareness is key, and that getting more people involved. There's several hundred people at this webinar. If all of us told 100 people about this, and you know, talk to our friends and neighbors in a way that could motivate them to change, that's a key piece too. But I think that however people can and feel called to engage on this, and what works for them, that's what we need. It's an all hands on deck moment.
This is a kind of related question, so I'm going to take it right here. Thanks, Sam, for moving this over. Why is there no discussion here of the importance of value-added forestry? Well, probably because these two were trying to cover a huge amount of terrain and assessing the, but I'm sure you have a few thoughts about value-added forestry.
I think it's really important, if we're going to take trees from the forest, that we do better than massive raw log exports. I think it's a bit defeating. I feel a bit defeated when we talk about it, because I remember talking about it in the 90s when I was in university. And I feel like, I don't know if we've gotten any better at that. I do know, I can't name them, but actually watched a recent documentary that was really great, and that highlighted small individual operations where that's happening. People using, you know, the pieces that the industry didn't take, and then creating something beautiful from those, or creating something that there's demand for from those. And there are many other and better ways than that as well. And there is government discussion of that. So I mentioned some of these different pots of funding. One of them is specifically to move to more value-added products. We still have to be careful though about where we get the trees for that.
Yeah.
I think we're trying to do differently with our old growth forests. And so I don't feel that we have enough old growth left to even do value added with that. I think it's much more important to keep it growing and healthy. So maybe we can talk about value added on our second and third growth forests would be my preference.
Right. Thanks for that, Shelley. Really important point. Torrance, do you want to do just one or two sentences on this? I want to get in another question if I can.
Yeah, just doing more with less, and turning the second growth forest, third growth forest, rather than shipping them away raw, which we still do in the form of raw log exports, but turning those into the most valuable thing they can be turned into, so that we can offset leaving lots of the second growth and all of the old growth still standing.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to squeeze in two more questions by asking you to be really tight on this. I'm going to give this one to you, Torrance. How much of the old growth area we are trying to protect in the interior are we trying to protect in the interior as opposed to on the coast and on Vancouver Island? Are you able to give some sense of that, please?
Yeah, another reason why the technical advisory panel analysis is strong is because it is province-wide, right? The initial deferral areas skew heavily to the coast and heavily to the island. And their analysis of that 2.6 million, there's fairly equal distribution across all ecosystem types and all regions of the province. So there's as much at-risk old growth, you know, in very generally the Northeast as there is in the West or the Southwest.
Great, thank you for that, Torrance. Okay, the last question, perhaps not exactly the one that we want to end on, but nevertheless, it's here, we'll see. What is the current position of the Hesquiaht, Didadat, and Hesquiaht First Nations on having the Fairy Creek watershed designated area, brackets Zone A and Zone B, extended beyond June 8th, 2023, and on what terms? Do any of you know the answer to that question?
No, I don't know the answer.
I don't know. I know when it was requested, it was stated that the Hesquiaht Band Council is doing a land use plan, but there was no timeline about when that will be for the whole territory. But there was no timeline given about when that will be completed. So I think it would depend on where that process is at, and I don't think there's been a public update on that.
Thank you on that. And Mariah, I'm assuming you may not know. Okay. So this is a question coming right out of the, you think it's important to help out at Fairy Creek again this year in whatever way possible to continue to get international attention and show to what lengths BC will go to suppress people trying to protect old growth. That's you're sort of being asked about your attitude towards strategies for people, but if you want to speak to it, go ahead. I'm sure it's on the minds of people. Torrance, you're on, and then
I think that Mariah's advice to, talk to communities, figure out where people are at, build relationships with the local nation if you can, and let that guide you in your deliberation. There was a lot of contention, a lot of controversy around Fairy Creek, as well as, a lightning rod moment to draw attention to this issue. I think both those need to be factored in and considered, and people need to make the call that works for them and that's right in their hearts.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Torrance. Shelley, you want to speak to that?
I think that's a perfect answer. And I would only add that another approach is to reach out every day and get everyone to reach out every day to your MLA and to tell them what you think, and so that the pressure remains high on the provincial government to work with those nations to make it happen.
Thank you. Okay, I think I'm going to bring us to a close now. It's 8:29. I'll see if I can do it in maybe 2 minutes. First of all, to all of the participants that have been here, a number of you have stayed with us till the end. Thank you so much. And as we've said, this is recorded, so you can watch it again, and hopefully the other few hundred that signed up will be able to watch it later. But not just to thank you for turning up, but to thank you for the way that you've turned up for old growth all over this province. And there has been so much creative work done, and I want to just bow down to you all for everything that you have done. And now to the panelists, I want to begin by my big appreciation for you, Mariah, in standing for your people and making it so clear how important how important it is that we're grounded in our commitment to understanding what it means that this is Indigenous land. And all that means in terms of the systems of learning and the way that we consider to build relationships, that we have to take that into account. So thank you so much for joining us. Shelley, great to get to know you a bit more and to get a sense of your broad way of thinking about things in terms of policy and the ways that can be shifted, hopefully. And then Torrance, well, you've got all the policy stuff down, but boy, you sure do have the facts down too. It's pretty amazing what you carry around in that brain of yours. I want to appreciate a question that somebody said, you can't answer all the questions here because there isn't time. Is there any chance that the panelists might be able to pick up some of these questions after the webinar? I'm seeing Torrance nod. I don't know what that means, but let's say we'll take that back and discuss that as an idea, because there are a lot more questions. And so I want to reinforce that we're hoping that your energy, you may be resting a little bit over the summer, but that you will move towards helping us mark the September period for the third anniversary of the Old Growth Strategic Review, which has not been implemented. And let's see if we can find the ways to be massively creative and in their faces in the way that we need to be. We can be gentle, we can be angry, we can be all the things that we need to be, but we have to be there and not let up. If you want more information, I think that I'm asking you, Em, if you're going to put the contact information in the, I haven't been following the chat, so I'm not sure. But if you want to find out more about what we are doing or be connected, use the email united for being a number, oldgrowth@gmail.com, united for old growth. I'm going to just put it in. I'm not sure.
Looks like Em put it in the chat for us.
You're putting them in now. Great. Okay. So there's links. We're around. We're here. We're not going away. You're not going away. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And may you enjoy the bird song as the evening winds down. wherever
Thank you very much.
wherever you may be. Yeah. Thanks,
Thank
folks.
you.
Thanks, everyone.